Holding what, 1.5 trillion worth all over the world. They're holding U.S. currencies. They want to get out of them in a way where they're not going to lose on their investments. There's going to be a world currency. There's going to be a new reserve currency. They're going to push it through the IMF. That's going to be the banksters that are going to be in charge of it. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
There was also a question to Geithner. Do you think that the U.S. dollar ought to be replaced? And he blew it. He had a moment of candor where he said, yeah, we're considering that. So on that day, the dollar went down 1% within a couple of minutes.
Chinese government proposal about a global currency and about the IMF regulations, the new IMF idea about the general agreements to borrow and having a faster ability to disperse to the emerging market.
As I understand this proposal, it's a proposal designed to increase the use of the IMF's special drawing rights. We're actually quite open to that suggestion.
Timothy Geithner's comment about global currency is not off the table because it's not off the table and it's going to come. The whole world is ready to bail out of bucks. They just want to do it in a way where they're not going to lose on their investments. That's all that's going on.
All the people around the world, the Japanese who have $1 trillion, the Chinese who have $1 trillion, the Saudis have $1 trillion, the Europeans something similar, they're all going to dump it at the same time. The rush for the exits. And that will then create hyperinflation.
When America finishes supplying the manpower and the military for standardization of the world into the one system, and they want a secular world society with a hint of greening and Gia worship for sustainability reasons. America, as they're finishing off this agenda, they'll be pulling the rug from underneath Americans at home at the same time towards the latter stages.
When the dollar starts to slide, and this was always the nightmare of Paul Adolph Volcker, who is now sitting in the Obama White House, once the dollar starts to go, there's nothing to stop it. There's no useful way that you can stop it once it begins to gather momentum. So I think we're facing the probability of some form of dollar panic combined with hyperinflation sometime during the Obama presidency.
They're now pulling the rug away from under the feet of the people. They're becoming rapidly a non-manufacturing country. Any country that can't manufacture its own goods, even for self-defense, therefore is no longer sovereign, independent, and able to sustain itself, which tells you that this is all part of the plan.
It started with the very beginning when you established that there was a Federal Reserve System given the power of the state to create money out of nothing and to do so without any regard to the will of the people, without any regard to what's behind the money system. In other words, strictly political and economic motives for the bankers and the politicians. Once you granted that power to a group, the Federal Reserve System, the economic crisis was inevitable. This has happened before. Every time in history when the government was given the power, or a group of banks in conjunction with the government was given the power to expand the money supply at will, those economic systems always wound up in crisis and always collapsed. So there's no reason to believe that the United States was given some kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, an exemption from the processes of history. So the economic crisis began at the very beginning, and as a matter of fact, when the founders of the Federal Reserve System met on Jekyll Island back in 1910 and were drafting the Federal Reserve Act, one of the things they discussed was how to pass on the inevitable losses to the taxpayers. They knew that inevitably something like this would happen, and they knew that there had to be some way to get out of it without destroying the banks, of course, because they were the banks. And they said, aha, we'll go into partnership with the government, we'll take our cartel agreement and pass it into law, call it the Federal Reserve Act, and we'll make the taxpayer come online and be responsible to bail us out if and when the failure finally comes.
Who's going to soak up the derivatives? Who's going to soak up the debt? Who's going to be penalized? And right now, it looks like Wall Street's getting bailed out, and the little guy in the middle of Main Street America are all going to pay the penalty.
Can the economy be turning around here? Are happy days here again? And can we actually have growth without jobs? Is this an oxymoron, jobless recovery?
We're going into the greatest depression. There will be no job growth. Unemployment will continue to escalate. Along with it, so too will crime, poverty, kidnappings, boss snappings. And the more things spin out of control, the harder the hammer is going to come down by the federal government to keep everyone in control.
Power is much, much more important to them than money is. Money is only a way to the means. Power is the end result.
The elite's main goal is to destroy national sovereignty and individual independence. To consolidate their grip on power, the banksters create artificial debt bubbles that are mathematically impossible to pay back.
These are those sinister, toxic assets, the complex financial instruments that they talk about but never really name. They're paper based on paper. They're credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, structured investment vehicles, auction rate securities, and so on down the line. It's an immense mass of cancerous, fictitious, speculative paper, bloated in value, impossible to bail out. Triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they tried.
The Wall Street cronies are crooks. If you leave the vault to the bank open, these people are going to help themselves. The job of the government is to make sure there's somebody there to make sure the vault is closed, and very few people have the combination.
I'm William K. Black, Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. I was a senior regulator in a number of different positions during the heart of the savings and loan crisis. On a staff level, I led the re-regulation of the savings and loan industry. The purpose of regulation and effective criminal prosecution is to make sure that cheaters don't prosper, that honest manufacturers win in competition. The primary driver of the current crisis is accounting control fraud. These are frauds led by the CEOs of the major lending institutions and major banks and institutional buyers of toxic waste product. How did it start? It started with mortgages, particularly non-prime mortgages. In September of 2004, the FBI warned that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, their words, and that this epidemic of mortgage fraud would cause an economic crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle if it wasn't stopped. The FBI found that 80% of the mortgage fraud was being induced by the lenders, not by the borrowers. You know, much of the rage has been against the borrowers, but if you want rage, it should be at the CEOs who became fabulously wealthy by following a strategy based on fraud.
The Wall Street people and their friends here at the Federal Reserve and at the U.S. Treasury and down the Washington Mall here at the U.S. Capitol. That's where the damage was done, and if people want to vent their anger, they need to vent it against these people.
Between the Bush-Paulson administration and the Obama, Summers, Geithner, Volcker administration, there's really a total continuity of economic and financial policy.
Geithner was on board at the Fed, the New York Fed, dealing with all these institutions. He didn't get it. And then we had this fellow who came up afterward, Mr. Friedman. He was on the Goldman Sachs board, and he didn't last too long as the Fed chairman. Why? Because he had a conflict of interest. Is it possible that there's so much conflict of interest here that all you folks don't even realize that you're helping people that you're associated with, and you should be recusing yourself for America's ethics?
I behaved with the...
You don't think you should have recused yourself when you asked Lehman to go in bankruptcy, you didn't put Bear Stearns in bankruptcy, and then you folded Merrill Lynch into... I mean, isn't there some point where you got to say, hey, I got a conflict of interest here? You don't feel any kind of scintilla of ethics on this thing at all?
Totally. I operated very consistently within the ethic guidelines I had as Secretary of the Treasury, and